In a log house on the edge of a Russian village, a massive brick structure takes up nearly a quarter of the living space. It is fired once before dawn. The flames burn down by mid-morning, the coals are raked aside, and a round clay pot goes into the chamber. Inside that pot are exactly two things: cracked buckwheat and water. The pot is sealed, the iron door is shut, and nobody touches it for the rest of the day. There is no flame anymore. The bricks themselves do the cooking, releasing their stored heat so slowly that the grain inside never boils, never scorches, never dries out. It softens, swells, and separates into distinct nutty kernels over 6 or more hours. When the family opens the pot at the evening meal, they are eating a dish their great-great-grandparents ate, prepared the same way, from the same grain, in the same kind of oven. That dish was Kasha, and for roughly 1,000 years, it was the single most important food in the Russian peasant world. So how did two ingredients, a seed that is not even technically a grain and plain water, sustain one of the harshest agricultural societies in Europe? The answer involves botany, chemistry, and a piece of engineering that modern kitchens still have not matched. It was the 12th century, and buckwheat was already appearing in the written records of Kievan Rus, the medieval state that preceded Russia. The word the Slavs used for it tells you where they thought it came from: grechka. The root is the same as the Russian word for Greek, and according to the food historian William Pochlebkin, the name stuck because for years the crop was cultivated mainly by Greek monks at Orthodox monasteries. The plant itself had travelled much farther than Greece. Buckwheat was domesticated in inland Southeast Asia, possibly as early as 6000 BC, and migrated west over thousands of years through Central Asia and the Volga region before reaching Slavic fields. By the time it arrived, the Slavs already had a word for hot grain dishes cooked soft in water: kasha. The word is older than buckwheat's arrival, older than most of the recorded history of the region. Millet kasha, barley kasha, oat kasha, spelt kasha. The dish predates the grain that would come to define it. And kasha was never just dinner. In medieval Rus, it was woven into every threshold of human life. When a child was born, a kasha was cooked to market, with a rooster for a boy and a hen for a girl. When a couple married, they cooked porridge together as a ritual act, a guarantee of prosperity in the household they were founding. At funerals, a sweetened ritual grain dish called kutia accompanied the dead, a tradition ethnographers trace back to long before Christianity reached the region. Armies cooked cauldrons of kasha before battle, and they cooked it again afterward, including at reconciliations between former enemies. Sharing kasha from one pot was a binding act. The Russian language still carries the fossil of that idea. To this day, saying you cannot cook kasha with someone means the person cannot be cooperated with at all. And the dish cuts the other way too. Zavarit kashu, literally to cook up a kasha, means to create a mess, to start trouble somebody else will have to clean up. Centuries of feuds, failed deals, and family arguments got filed under porridge metaphors, because the pot was the one object every household in the country had in common. I mean, when refusing to share porridge with a man becomes a permanent grammatical structure for distrust, you know the dish mattered. Most people never heard about this part. The reason buckwheat conquered the Russian countryside had very little to do with taste and almost everything to do with what the plant demanded from the farmer, which was close to nothing. Start with the soil. Agricultural research from North Dakota State University and Cornell confirms what Russian peasants knew empirically for centuries. Buckwheat will produce a better crop on poor soil than virtually any other grain. Its roots secrete mild acids that unlock phosphorus. Other plants cannot access, which means it feeds itself from ground that would starve wheat. It actively dislikes rich soil. Give buckwheat too much nitrogen and the stalks grow tall, fall over, and the yield drops. For a peasant with no manure to spare and exhausted sandy fields, this was not a compromise crop. It was the only crop that wanted what he had. Keep that fertilizer aversion in mind, because it explains something strange about the modern world. Buckwheat was a common crop across the northeastern United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. Then cheap nitrogen fertilizer arrived in the 20th, wheat and corn yields exploded, and buckwheat, the one crop that refuses extra nitrogen, was pushed off western fields almost entirely. The same trait that made it indispensable to a Russian peasant made it worthless to an industrial farmer. Then there is the calendar. Buckwheat reaches maturity in roughly 10 to 12 weeks from planting. The Russian growing season is brutally short, squeezed between late frosts in spring and early frosts in autumn, and buckwheat fits inside that window with room to spare. If a wheat or rye planting failed in spring, a peasant could still sow buckwheat in early summer and harvest food before winter. It was the insurance policy growing in the field, and the plant defended itself. Buckwheat germinates fast and throws up a dense canopy that shades out competing weeds, an effect so reliable that modern organic farmers still plant it specifically to smother thistle and quackgrass. A medieval family had no herbicides and limited labour. A crop that did its own weeding was worth its weight in rye, and the field paid one more dividend. Buckwheat flowers heavily, and those blossoms produce a dark, malty honey that beekeepers prize to this day. A planting of Gretschka fed the family twice, once through the pot and once through the hive. So the field economics were unbeatable, a seed that grew on bad land in a short season with no fertilizer and no weeding. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense to people raised on the idea that peasant food was nutritionally empty, because the seed itself is one of the most complete plant foods in the human diet. Buckwheat is not a true cereal. It is the seed of a broadleaf plant related to rhubarb and sorrel, which is why its chemistry breaks all the cereal rules. Raw buckwheat groats carry around 13 grams of protein per 100 grams, and unlike wheat, rye, or barley, that protein contains all 9 essential amino acids. The critical one is lysine. Nearly every true grain is deficient in lysine, which is why grain-dependent populations across history developed deficiency diseases unless they paired their grain with legumes or animal products. Buckwheat carries its own lysine. A peasant family that ate buckwheat Kasha as its staple was getting something close to complete protein from a single plant, without meat, without beans, without knowing why it worked. The minerals follow the same pattern. Per 100 grams, raw buckwheat delivers over 200 milligrams of magnesium and over 2 milligrams of iron, along with manganese, copper, and B vitamins. It also contains rutin, a flavonoid concentrated in buckwheat at levels few common foods match, which modern research has studied for its effects on blood vessels and inflammation. And the carbohydrates release slowly. Buckwheat sits low on the glycemic index, which means a morning bowl of Kasha released its energy across hours of field labour instead of burning off before noon. Steady fuel for a 12-hour working day, drawn from a plant that grew on the worst land in the village. So yeah, not exactly the nutritional dead-end peasant food gets remembered as. Everything about this seed was solved. The agronomy, the protein, the minerals. If the story had stopped here, Kasha would still be a remarkable food. It does not stop here, because the seed was only half of the system. The other half was built out of brick, stood in the centre of the house, and weighed several tons. The Russkaya pech, the Russian stove, appears in the historical record by the 15th century and possibly earlier. Calling it a stove undersells it badly. It was a masonry mass the size of a small room, built of brick or clay, positioned at the heart of the izba, the peasant log house. It heated the home, baked the bread, dried mushrooms and herbs and wet clothing, and carried a sleeping platform on top where the elderly and children spent the coldest nights of the year. The men who built these structures, the pechniki, held elevated status in village society because a badly built stove smoked, baked unevenly, and bled heat. A good one was the difference between a livable winter and a lethal one. The engineering principle was thermal mass. Smoke and hot combustion gases were routed through a labyrinth of internal channels, transferring their heat into the brick before exiting the chimney. Instead of sending most of the fire's energy up the flue the way an open hearth does, the stove captured it and stored it. In well-built examples, the brick kept radiating warmth for 2 or even 3 days after a single burn, helped along by a brick flue running through the attic that slowed the cooling, and some households rotated the smoke through a chamber up there to cure meat and fish on the way out. 1 fire, 4 jobs. A single firing in the morning kept the structure radiating warmth for a full day, and wood consumption dropped dramatically compared to open fireplaces, which mattered enormously in a country where winter lasted half the year and every log was hauled by hand. For cooking, this design produced something no modern appliance replicates: a falling heat curve. The fire burned hot in the morning, the bread went in first to catch the peak temperatures, and as the bricks slowly surrendered their heat across the day, the chamber drifted down through a long, gentle decline. Into that decline went the Kasha pot. Russians have a specific word for what happened inside it: tomleni, languishing. The sealed clay pot held the grain at temperatures below a boil for hour after hour, while the steam trapped under the lid kept anything from drying out. The starches gelatinized completely. The kernels absorbed their water and held their shape instead of collapsing into paste. Compounds that need long, low heat to develop had all the time they wanted. A pot of buckwheat that simmers on a burner for 15 minutes and a pot that languishes in falling brick heat for 6 hours are chemically and texturally different foods made from identical ingredients. The stove was the third ingredient nobody counts. The household ran in one daily thermal cycle, and the same cycle that languished the Kasha baked the family's rye loaves in its hottest hour. That pairing of bread and porridge from one oven is exactly the territory we have been mapping in our written guides. The medieval bakery collection at our store now covers it from 3 angles: practical recipes for cooking historical dishes in a modern kitchen, the sourdough manual for building and keeping a living starter the way medieval households did, and the sourcing guide for finding the right grains today. The link is in the description. Now back to the pot. By the late medieval period, buckwheat had spread across the fields of Rus, and the dish it produced was carrying more than households. It was carrying the army. The Russian word for a military cook is kashiva. Translated literally, it means kasha maker. That is the entire job title. The logic was the same one operating in the peasant izba, scaled up to a regiment. A sack of buckwheat groats is light, keeps through campaign conditions, and turns into hot complete protein with nothing but water, a kettle, and a fire. Soldiers' folklore enshrined it in a saying that survives to this day: Shchida kasha, pishcha nasha. Cabbage soup and kasha, that is our food. 2 dishes, both engineered for the same constraints, both cooked by the slow, moist heat the culture had perfected. The empire that fielded some of the largest armies in European history marched on a porridge made from a seed that grew on land nobody else wanted. Logistics disguised as a side dish, and here is where the story usually inverts. The food that fed serfs and conscripts is supposed to be the food people abandon the moment they can afford to. That never fully happened with Kasha. It moved up the social ladder instead of off the table, into monastery refectories, merchant households, and eventually onto noble menus with butter, mushrooms, and cream folded in. Another proverb sealed its reputation. Cashew maslom ne is Portish. You cannot spoil kasha with butter. The base was considered so sound that improvement had no ceiling. The dish that marked births, weddings, and funerals in the 12th century was still doing all three in the 19th, and a version of it is sold in every Russian grocery store this morning. Few staple foods anywhere on earth have held their position for that long without interruption. Now let's make it, because the method is the point, and you can reproduce the core of it in a modern oven this week. You need whole buckwheat groats, hulled but intact, not flour and not the crushed fine grades. You need water. Salt is the one addition even the strictest historical version allows, and butter is the upgrade the proverb endorses, but the system works without either. First, toast the dry groats. Spread them in a dry pan over medium heat, and move them for several minutes until they darken slightly and smell nutty. Russian kitchens have done this for generations, and it serves two purposes. The toasting deepens the flavour through browning reactions, and it firms the outer layer of each kernel so the finished kasha stays separate instead of turning gluey. If you buy groats labelled kasha in a store, they often come pre-toasted, and you can skip this step. Next, the ratio. 1 part groats, 2 parts water by volume, plus a pinch of salt. Combine them in a heavy pot with a tight lid. A Dutch oven works, and a clay baker works even better. Bring it just to a simmer on the stovetop, then seal the lid and move the whole pot into an oven set at 250 degrees Fahrenheit, 120 degrees Celsius. Then leave it alone. 1 hour minimum, and 2 or 3 hours if you want to get closer to true Tomliny. Do not stir it, and do not lift the lid, because the trapped steam is doing the work the brick chamber used to do. When you finally open it, every kernel should be swollen, tender, and distinct, with a depth the 15-minute stovetop version never reaches. Finish with butter if you want the 19th century experience. Eat it alongside soup, under mushrooms and onions, or on its own, the way most people who ever ate it did. That clay pot going into the dying heat of a brick stove, the one we started with, was never a primitive making do. It was the visible end of a complete system, a seed that fed itself from poor soil and finished inside a short northern summer. A protein profile that quietly solved a deficiency problem most grain cultures never escaped. An oven that converted 1 armful of firewood into a full day of heating, baking, and cooking. None of it was luxurious, and all of it was correct. We tend to assume that a meal with 2 ingredients must be a meal of last resort. Kasha argues the opposite. It lasted 1,000 years precisely because there was nothing left in it to remove. If you found this investigation valuable, subscribe to Medieval Way. Every week we dig into the techniques and knowledge that kept people alive when the world offered no safety net. Drop a comment and tell us, have you ever cooked buckwheat the slow way, in the oven instead of on the burner?